From the moment we begin to form an identity, long before we can even articulate a coherent thought or memory, the figure of the father, whether present, absent, nurturing, neglectful, protective, or abusive, imprints itself deeply into the foundations of our psyche, shaping the unconscious blueprint of how we perceive ourselves, how we engage with others, and how we move through the world with either confidence or doubt, security or fear, strength or fragility. It is a difficult truth to accept, often resisted by the rational mind, but we must begin here, that the wounds we carry into adulthood, the patterns that quietly sabotage our relationships, the voices that whisper our unworthiness, and the chronic need to prove ourselves, to be seen, to be acknowledged, all stem from unresolved emotional residues of early relationships, and none leaves a deeper, more insidious scar than the unhealed father wound. This wound is not merely psychological, it is archetypal, cultural, and spiritual, rooted not only in your personal story but in the story of humanity itself, where the father has always stood not just as a person, but as a symbol of law, order, authority, protection, and, for many, conditional love that had to be earned rather than received freely. The father wound is not always obvious, for it doesn't always look like violence, abandonment, or cruelty. It can also take the form of emotional absence, unavailability masked by financial provision, presence without attunement, authority without empathy, or even a kind of passive tolerance that fails to offer guidance, protection, and moral grounding when it was most needed. When the father is absent, whether physically, emotionally, or spiritually, the child grows up learning to seek approval elsewhere, to find validation through achievement, romantic attention, or performance. And although the adult may build a life that appears successful on the outside, within them resides a fragile, unanchored self, constantly asking, "Am I enough? Am I safe? Do I matter?" And when the father is present but domineering, overly critical, authoritarian, or unpredictable, the child internalizes a tyrant not just externally, but within. The voice of the superego becomes harsh, relentless, and punitive, creating an internal prison where nothing is ever good enough, and the only way to avoid punishment is to be perfect, to be obedient, to be invisible, or to rebel in ways that only recreate the original conflict. But whether through absence or oppression, neglect or control, the wound remains the same. The father, the one who is meant to provide the structural foundation of security, boundary, and belonging, has become the origin of instability, confusion, and inner fragmentation. And, until that is seen, felt, understood, and healed, we remain unconsciously enslaved to the past, endlessly replaying the same scripts in different relationships, different jobs, different environments, all while wondering why freedom continues to elude us. To heal the father wound is not to place blame or to sit in perpetual victim. It is, instead, the courageous act of returning to the original site of rupture, not to relive the pain, but to meet it with the awareness and strength that we did not have as children. To grieve what was missing, to release the fantasy that one day it will be corrected externally, and to reclaim the parts of ourselves we had to bury in order to survive the unmet needs of our early life. For many, the father wound manifests in their inability to trust themselves, trust others, trust life, and so they remain guarded, hyper-independent, or chronically dependent, locked in cycles of either avoidance or obsession, fear of abandonment, or fear of engulfment, all of which are rooted in the nervous system's learned response to an unpredictable or unsafe paternal presence. For others, it shows up as perfectionism, the constant drive to achieve, to perform, to prove that they are worthy of love, of attention, of being kept. And beneath this is a deep-seated belief that love must be earned, that safety is conditional, and that the self must be continually improved in order to be accepted. And in some, the father wound creates a paralyzing fear of authority, be it bosses, teachers, police, or any figure perceived as having power, because their early experience with authority was one of punishment, humiliation, or rejection, and so their body associates assertiveness with danger, and submission with survival. On the other hand, there are those whose father wounds drive them to unconsciously recreate the father archetype in every partner, friend, or mentor they meet, only to be re-traumatized again and again by their unmet expectations, or to become controlling and emotionally unavailable themselves, as a way to avoid feeling the original helplessness they once knew. And yet, this wound, so complex, so layered, so deeply woven into our psychic fabric, is not beyond healing, but it demands a process far deeper than intellectual understanding, far more honest than blame, and far more painful than we might expect. Because it requires us to feel the very things we've spent a lifetime avoiding: abandonment, rejection, shame, vulnerability, and grief. Healing the father wound begins by acknowledging its existence, not just as a concept, but as an emotional truth that lives in your body, in your behaviors, in your compulsions, in your silence, in your rage, in your need to be seen, or your fear of being seen. And once you allow yourself to truly feel that pain, to name it, to validate it, you begin the sacred work of breaking the unconscious loyalty to the wounded inner child. This loyalty is what keeps many of us stuck, because a part of us still hopes that if we keep suffering, if we keep being good, if we keep earning, maybe, the Father or what he represents will finally notice, finally approve, finally love us in the way we needed, and so we postpone our liberation in exchange for a fantasy of resolution that will never come from the outside. And that is the hardest pill to swallow, that your healing is not dependent on your father changing, apologizing, or even understanding. It is dependent on your willingness to stop waiting for that day, to stop living as though your life is a plea for recognition, and to start becoming the parent to yourself that you never had, holding yourself with the love, the discipline, the protection, and the honor that was once absent. You see, the father wound is not just about the man who raised you, or didn't raise you. It's about the way his presence or absence shaped your beliefs about love, power, identity, and worth, and until you rewrite those beliefs, not through wishful thinking but through deep inner work, you will live in reaction rather than creation, bound by invisible scripts rather than led by conscious will. In Jungian psychology, the father represents not only the personal father but also the paternal archetype, the aspect of the psyche that governs order, logic, structure, boundaries, and purpose. And when the relationship with the father is broken, these aspects of the self become fragmented, distorted, or underdeveloped, leaving the individual without a clear internal compass. And so, healing the father wound is also about reclaiming your relationship to order, to discipline, to ambition, to authority, not by rejecting it completely or submitting to it blindly, but by integrating it within yourself in a way that supports your growth, rather than controls or limits it. For men, this healing often involves confronting the fear of becoming their father, or the fear of never living up to his legacy, and then consciously choosing a new model of masculinity that honors emotional truth, vulnerability, and responsibility, rather than suppression, dominance, and stoic detachment. For women, it may involve releasing the unconscious need to find the father in every lover, or to seek protection at the cost of autonomy, and instead, nurturing their own inner authority, allowing the masculine within them to serve as a source of strength, rather than a reminder of trauma. And for all of us, regardless of gender, it requires the willingness to question the cultural mythology of the father, the idea that power must come from fear, that love must be earned, that authority must be obeyed without question, and to dismantle the internalized systems that keep us small, compliant, and disconnected from our authentic self. Freedom, real freedom, is not the absence of rules or the rejection of all structure. It is the capacity to choose consciously, to live from a place of alignment rather than reaction, to speak and act and love from a place that is not bound by fear or wounded history, but rooted in the clarity of a healed self. But that freedom can only emerge when the father wound is faced, honored, and transformed, when the child, who once longed for love, becomes the adult who gives that love to themselves. When the fear of not being enough is replaced by the inner certainty that your worth was never up for negotiation, and when the ghost of the father is no longer an inner tyrant but a lesson that taught you how to come home to yourself. You will never be free until you heal your father wound. Not because you are weak or broken, but because the wound shaped the very architecture of your emotional life. And to ignore it is to let it rule you from the shadows. So if there is a voice inside you that still aches for approval, that still trembles at the face of power, that still sabotages love or shrinks in the presence of authority, listen to it, not to silence it, but to understand it, to comfort it, and to finally give it what it never received: your attention, your compassion, your protection, and above all, your conscious choice to no longer live from that pain,